Photography, audio commentary. Image 1. I quite like this image and it is one of my better images. I quite like how I made it warmer when compared to the original image and attempted to add some kind of sunset vibe. One bad thing that came from this is that there isn't the proper directional lighting that you would get from a proper sunset. So, for example, the mountains, they don't have any directional light from where the sunset is supposed to be, which is from the left, which you can see from the buildings. So that should be changed next time, where the mountains should have a bit of brightness when compared to what it is now. Also, the reddish pink streaks in the sky aren't reflected on the water. The water has also been warmed up by the image editing, but it hasn't been added enough to make it believable. Also, the character isn't reflected in the water, which also makes the scene a bit worse off. One more thing I'd like to add would be the muddy shading on the character. The jacket's done fairly okay, but the skin shading looks really muddy and shouldn't be that brown. It should be more saturated with a bit more red. So it looks quite unnatural and dead when compared to what it should look like. As for the logo, I quite like the way it looks because it doesn't obstruct too much of the image. The Canon logo is given a darker background, which is better because Canon logos tend to look better behind, like if they're backed with black or some other dark color. I also asked some other people for feedback, and what they said was that the hair looked a bit off because they didn't have a lot of texture when compared to what real hair would look like, and also didn't really fit the size of the head. It looks a bit more like a wig than hair. In this image, the link to sustainability was supposed to be the ocean and mountains. However, due to the man-made structure and boat, this is diminished and links to sustainability are a bit weak. The Kiyosei philosophy is incorporated into the peaceful atmosphere in the image. The natural life, humans, and giant person can coexist comfortably together in a peaceful environment. That's the idea behind this image. This is my second image and it was improved based on the original second image. Personally, I think this one looks a lot better, but still could use a lot of work. So one of the main things that I like about the image is that the highlight, there's like a sunlight coming in, which makes the scene a bit more interesting, as well as cast shadows, which makes the character a bit more believable and feel more real in the scene. However, one of the downsides is that it's not using any proper composition, so no rule of thirds or some other composition scheme used. One other thing I'd like to add is that the sunlight doesn't behave the way real sunlight would, and it kind of increases the warmth and brightness in the background as well as the midground, so some of the stores in the background that were fine originally are a bit overexposed now due to the editing. Also, the reflections on the glass don't really show this character or the highlight, which makes it a bit less believable than what it could be. One other thing I'd like to add is that the color, like the overall character design isn't done very well because it's just two pieces of clothing and isn't very interesting. So it could have been a lot more interesting if there were maybe more pieces of clothing or a bag or something to increase the complexity of the character. As for the logo and catchphrase, they're placed in pretty basic positions, and it doesn't look too interesting. But I've tried some other layouts using these elements, and I found that this is the best because the fake highlights and the drawing already take up a lot of the image, and adding more, so like the Canon logo and catchphrase, if I make them any bigger or make them more a larger part of the image, they'll overpower the original photographic elements of the image. That being said, there's probably a more interesting way to lay out these elements that makes it more interesting and doesn't take away from the image. Links to sustainability would be through the grass and trees within the urban environment. The synergy of themes makes it better than using a normal mall without natural elements. However, it also has the same problem as the first image. As the scene has many man-made elements, it diminishes the theme of sustainability. The Kiyosei philosophy is present as it shows large numbers of people peacefully coexisting without conflict. So image 3. Overall, I don't really like this image. The original photograph was pretty okay and I quite liked the way it looked, but the editing of the image doesn't really fit what I envisioned for the final image. Also, the drawing looks quite off when compared to the rest of the image. Mainly lighting wise, it's a bit too bright, so it looks a bit off, as well as the fact that there isn't too much of a visible shadow from the character. As for the Canon logo and the catchphrase, I made the Canon logo quite big and the catchphrase big because since the character is quite small and the effect we're having on the overall photograph isn't too large, we can play with the logo and the catchphrase a bit more because it won't overpower the image too much. So in this case, I made the logo really big, as well as put both of them in the central parts of the image. In my opinion, this is better than the bottom layout, but this layout doesn't look too great and has more of an amateur feel to it. As for the editing of the image, mainly I'd changed the way I edited the image. I'd try and add a bit more warmth and life into the image, so maybe more of a golden color, which is kind of what the original image had. Also, another thing I changed is add more of a shadow to under the character, which grounds them a bit more in the scene, as well as changing the colors I used on them because it doesn't fit the overall colors in the image, as well as the way the character's been shaded. It's not realistic and it looks way too bright when compared to what it should be in this kind of lighting. One more thing I'd change is the gesture of the character. It's quite plain and stiff and doesn't look natural. So I would change that if I were to do it again. Overall, in terms of sustainability and Kiyosei philosophy, the image is terrible and does not fit either. So this is my fourth image. Overall, I think it looks okay. The image itself could be improved by adding a bit more atmosphere and color. So adding a bit more life into the image, because right now it looks very plain and flat and not honestly a bit boring. The drawing itself, it fits the low contrast coloring style that's been used in the image itself. Overall, I think the drawing itself is one of my better ones because it actually fits quite well into the image and doesn't look too plain and boring. As for the logo and catchphrase, I think it looks quite nice with it being placed at the top area of the image with the red line going through. I quite like this red line aesthetic because it's been seen in some Red Cannon's other advertisements and it actually fits quite well and allows the catchphrase and the logo to kind of blend together into one nice piece of the image. Also, I added these small frames that you might see in some other Canon advertisements into the image. These don't have that much of an effect, but I think they help make it a bit better. As for the image itself, as for improvements, overall, I'd mainly go for a brighter and more vibrant color scheme with a bit more golds and reds, which you might see in the original image. Also, as for the drawing itself, it would need to be adjusted for these changes, which would be quite difficult because low contrast or desaturated colors actually make the drawing process a lot easier. So in the real one, it would be a lot more difficult when coloring in the character. In terms of canon themes, I think the image fits quite well as there are plants within the urban structure and they connect to themes of sustainability. However, the Kiyosei philosophy is not really referenced and should be something I think about in the future. So this is my fourth image. Overall, I quite liked it. The original image the photo was really bright and overall I quite liked the edit I made to it. But in terms of the editing process, one thing I'd change would be there's a small reflection at the back that I forgot to remove, and that's one of the main things I would delete or change. Like I'd paint over it in black if I could do it again. Also, so now onto the drawing. Overall, it doesn't look that bad, but the hair looks really weird. Same problem as the first one. It's like a wig, not like a wig. It's like it feels like it's a solid. It doesn't feel soft or, like how hair should feel when you look at it. Also, the shading on the clothes doesn't look all that natural, and feels a bit weird when you look at it. The eyes too, they feel a bit blank and unnatural. So overall, the drawing feels really unnatural, and yeah. Also, I'd change the pose a bit to make the foot kind of hang off, which would make it a bit more believable, because if the character is interacting with the environment, it feels more real and grounded. Yeah. So other than that, in terms of the layout, I quite like the layout with the Canon logo at the top, with the line and the catchphrase below that. As I've said before, I quite like this layout, so personally I wouldn't change that one too much. There's a small frame, like the ones that I've used in my other photos around the character, which if I were to change it, I would remove that frame, because it doesn't add too much to the image, and it looks a bit out of place when compared to how the other frames looked in some of my other photos. But overall, this is one of my better ones. Since the original photo was quite overexposed, if I were to do it again, then I'd probably lower the brightness settings, so I'd capture more of the light. Because if you look at the two main light sources, like like the store front at the top looks okay, but the light at the side is way too overexposed and draws the viewer's attention to there, despite it not being one of the focal points. So that's also one thing I'd change. But overall, this is one of my better images. As for the themes within this image, I originally planned to add an animal in the scene, which would help the sustainability aspect of it. However, in the end, I changed the scene, and I forgot to take this into account when coming up with the new design, and thus didn't have any sustainability in the final design. As for Kiyosei philosophy, there is no direct link to it, as there is only one person in this scene. So this is my sixth and last image. Personally, I think this is one of my mediocre ones. It's okay, it's not too bad, not too great. So, first the image itself. The image was kind of taken for this kind of project, so I intentionally left the blank space on the left. But overall, it's not too interesting. There's no real main subject. So like the cars and the buses and stuff, they don't really stand out too much, which makes the photo a bit uninteresting, which isn't too, like, it doesn't affect this certain project too much, but if it was a normal photo, then it would definitely need to be changed there. As for the drawing itself, it's a bit plain. All of the colors are quite similar, so it doesn't really stand out too much when compared to some of the other drawings I made, like stand out from the environment. So overall, it doesn't look too terrible, but it's not that great either. So one thing I change about the character is the pose. The hand hanging over the railing, it looks a bit unnatural. Feels like the railing's clipping into the person. So maybe I'd move them a bit further away or past the railing, so closer to the camera. So just not interacting with the railing, because even though if it's done right, it would look a lot better. Since the railing's so thin, it's really hard to kind of depict it in a way where it's going through with such a small gap in the character. Like at my current level, I don't think I'd be able to do it. As for the shading, it's done better than some of my other drawings, so yeah, but the dress or the pants, like the lower area, it looks really plain. There's no, like, um, there's no gradient of shading, as well as the fact that there's some triangles where I tried to shade, but it didn't really work. Yeah. So that the pants kind of brings it down a bit. The shirt also doesn't have too much variation in the tones and colors. The skin's better than the clothes and the pants, but it still looks quite plain. As for the hair, it's kind of mediocre, I guess. It's not that great, but it's definitely not the worst hair I've done. As for the logo, I kept it quite simple this time, with the Canon logo actually being smaller than the catchphrase. Personally, I was just experimenting with this, and then I came across it, and I actually like it a lot more than the ones where the Canon logo is bigger than the catchphrase. So I kept this one. So for this one, for the layout of the Canon logo and stuff, I wouldn't change it too much because out of the experiments I did, this is the best one. But there might be some other layouts that might suit this kind of image more because with the red line and the Canon logo, it kind of blends it into the background a bit because the cars and the trees have kind of a similar value or shading, not shading, have a similar value or tone to the color Canon has chosen for their logo. So that's one thing I'd change. Maybe move it a bit higher or something. But I'd need to experiment and see what the optimal kind of position would be. Yeah. So overall, this is one of my better ones. Main changes are in the drawing and how I took the photo itself. But I'm quite happy with the layout, so I probably wouldn't change that. Unless the drawing kind of moves in a bit more, because the positioning would change how the images feels and how it kind of balances itself out. As for the sustainability aspect, I made sure to include trees in the photo, linking the image to sustainability. As for the Kyosei philosophy, there are numerous cars in the scene which suggests that there are people everywhere, which hopefully links to the idea of Kyosei. Rather than that, there isn't much linking Kyosei to my images. And as for other people's comments, for the most part I agree with the comments presented. But one thing I noticed was that the others didn't really comment on how there's a really small amount of attention towards the inclusion of Kyosei and sustainability themes. It really is quite subtle throughout most of my images. Things I need to keep in mind for future projects are the importance of logos, importance of the images as a series or as a group or collection, as well as the attention paid towards details